And thank you all for making the trip to Chicago. I have an introduction for all of the esteemed writers on the stage. And we will start with Ashley Shelby, who is at the end. She is a novelist, short story writer, and former environmental journalist. Her novel, South Pole Station, was a New York Times editor's pick and a Shelf Awareness Best Book of the Year. Her recent collection of climate fiction, Honeymoons and Temporary Locations, was named a Fresh Energy Favorite Climate Book of 2025 and is currently shortlisted for the Janet Heidinger Kafka Prize. And a brief introduction to her stories, Honeymoons and Temporary Locations. It explores the human dimensions of climate disruption through inventive, speculative narratives, from mutinous polar bears to solastalgia drugs and tours of submerged cities. She blurs plausibility and absurdity to reveal how communities adapt, grieve, and persist. Next to Ashley is Erin Kafal. She is an author and musician. Her writing, music, and film on loss and nature has appeared in many places and received awards, including a 2023 Whiting Creative Nonfiction Grant and a Social Justice News Nexus Fellowship. Her books include her memoir, The Mourner's Bestiary, and her novel, All the Water in the World, which is told in the voice of a girl gifted with a deep feeling for water. In the years after the glaciers met, Noni, her older sister, and her parents and their researcher friends have stayed behind in a deserted New York City in a settlement on the roof of the American Museum of Natural History. When a storm breaches the city's flood walls, Noni and her family must escape north in a canoe on the Hudson River, determined to find a way to make a new world that honors all that they've saved. Claire Wamenholm was a 2020-2021 McKnight Artist Fellow and a winner of the 2022 Montreal International Poetry Prize. She is the author of 3 poetry collections, most recently Meltwater, which was a finalist for the 2024 Minnesota Book Award and the 2024 Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award. Meltwater is also a 2025 National Book Foundation Science and Literature selection. Meltwater explores what it means to bring children in a world deflated by ecological loss, freighted with both delight and remorse. The book ultimately commits to the possibility of redemption, to the possibility that there is indeed grace worth suffering the empty universe for. It has been called a glittering kinetic testament to vanishing, of biodiversity, of climate stability, of a sense of safety. Meltwater is both vindication and balm. And Erica Meitner is the author of 6 books of poems, including Holy Moly, Carry Me, winner of the 2018 National Jewish Book Award and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Poetry, and Useful Junk. Meitner is a professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her newest work, Assembled Audience, is a book of poems on climate change and is forthcoming from Milkweed Editions in 2026. Her newest poems in there are about climate change, and she also documents coastal erosion, rising seas, and environmental degradation alongside intimate human rituals. These poems contrast the beauty and resiliency of ecosystems with the violence of climate catastrophe. And since 2017, since Hurricane Irma, she has been working on a long-term project that documents sea level rise in the built environment in Miami, Florida, with photographer and journalist Anna Berry Jester. So welcome, everybody. Very quickly, I'm Mitzi Rapkin. I am the host and producer of a literary podcast called First Draft, a dialogue on writing, which features a new author interview every week. I have interviewed more than 500 contemporary writers of poetry, fiction, essays, and nonfiction over the last 12 years from around the world. On the show, we explore the decisions and psychology that went into the writing of featured books and themes of the work and the human experience. So, all right, time to start chatting. So one of the things I have been thinking about at a conference like this is that there's so much discussion about policy and politics and science and academia, and everything that you do is so much, I think, about feeling, that writing, we read to understand what it's like to be human. We read to have empathy for our human experience. We read to see how artists make sense of the world in beautiful new ways and put language around that. So I wanted to ask you about this feeling component and what it's like to take that human emotion against a changing climate and put that into something that people will read that isn't like didactic. So feeling. And does anyone want to chime in?
Is this, oh, it is on, good. On the first time, perfect, what pros? I mean, I think it's like certainly true that American culture just in general, like we're so bad at grieving. We do not do a whole lot of like personal grieving. We certainly don't grieve in communities or like where our grief is visible to other people. Like a lot of other cultures and through periods of time have made their mourning or grieving visible. If you see someone walking down the street and their clothes are kind of torn in a certain way or they look a certain way, you can extend your empathy and your compassion out toward them even without knowing them just because you know they're grieving. And we don't really do that as a culture very much. And so I really am committed to the idea of art, especially like poetry and like fiction too, as places where the grieving is maybe not just like front and center, but is sort of the point, and you can like open up and invite people in, and they can then like recognize their own grief on the page and be like, yes, someone else has thought the same, has been in the same place, has thought the same thing, and has thought that this is worthy to make art out of, like art out of that feeling. So that motivates a lot of my practice, as I'm sure it does yours.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in fact, my memoir that came out in last October is literally titled The Mourner's Bestiary because I was very curious about this. I come from a family that's experienced mourning generationally, and the more that I thought about that quality of living with generational chronic illness, it seemed to me to be so similar to living with the generational impacts of climate and eco-collapse, and that we really need to reinvest in the practice of touching down into those feelings, because if we don't touch down into them, they remain terrifying, and then we make our actions to correct broken systems are really happening out of fear. But if we spend time in the collective practice of mourning, I think grief is very private, but mourning has rituals, just like what you're talking about, that become part of the public space, and the more that we enter into it, I think the more that we begin to share that, to be able to recognize the way in which we can all carry a piece of it, and to be able to figure out how to pass through the sort of the stasis of the feeling of, oh no, everything is going to be terrible, into what we do next. We share it together, we move through it together through the public ritual of acknowledging the feeling that we're all living with.
I think also, can people hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. I think also it's interesting that we're all working in different modes. Poetry kind of comes in two flavors. There's more narrative poetry that tells a story, and more lyric poetry that's more akin almost to song and creates a feeling through language. Poetry is oral, O-R-A-L, and oral, A-U-R-A-L, and there are ways that language moves through our bodies, both in mourning rituals with keening and other things, but also to create a kind of more embodied and visceral feeling that narrative can also create. I mean, both those things can. But in a time of where all of our devices are using predictive language, where I've been in the classroom for 30 years and my students are using AI for almost everything, being someone who works in the modes of language to create new kinds of language so that we can we can mourn, and before we can mourn, we have to witness, which is something I think that Claire was pointing to, and that can lead us to resistance and survival, modes of resistance and survival.
For me, I am really interested in the compartmentalization of the whole conversation. I was a journalist for many years, and so I was lucky enough to be able to spend a lot of time with scientists. And I have a deep curiosity about science, which I think everyone on this panel shares. It's in all of our work. But it's been very interesting to me to see, okay, you're a scientist, you're a writer. Some people are who care about the environment, who care about our planet, who are sad about what's happening. You're an environmentalist. you're not just a human being who is grieving the changes that we're seeing. I mean, our grief is being gaslit. It's not shared by everyone because many people don't think what's happening is anything to worry about, and that's a whole political discussion. But for me, I think with writers, what we try to do is synthesize. We try to synthesize a lot of different things to try to find meaning. So, for example, I love science. I love scientists. I unfortunately did not have the mind to do higher level science. But what I was able to do with my books was take a tiny piece of a scientific concept that I really wanted to write about and spend 2 years on it to master it, and then find some meaning in that. So, for example, my first book, South Pole Station, has a climate denier in it and a cosmologist. So I wanted those characters to sound plausible. I wanted someone who was a cosmologist or a climate scientist not to get pulled out of the book in a piece of dialogue to be like, what this climate scientist doesn't know what he's talking about. But at the same time, you know, I wanted to bring into that conversation these feelings that the other writers here have talked about. Grief, you know, how language connects us with each other, the importance of art, and the importance of making meaning out of things that have become compartmentalized, so like policy, you know, carbonization, all of these conversations are part of the same thing. We're all trying to make meaning of it. So I see our job as sort of bringing them all together in something hopefully readable as well. A lot of spinning plates.
So what do you think, you know, for everybody here and for people out in the world today, what is the role of climate poetry and climate fiction in the larger dialogue, and how can it contribute to what it's doing? I mean, I would say it's vital and imperative, and it's what makes us human. But when you are in a room, whether they're scientists or deniers or academics, like, what do you feel is the role of your work, and what more maybe can we do to get it into the conversation?
I mean, I think that the role of our work is to do what art does in all categories, right? Which is to have a conversation about the lived experience of being human and the embodiment of being human and the complexity of it. And I think when we create these sort of false separations, especially like what Ashley was talking about in terms of, well, it's a fit subject if you know everything about it and if you're a scientist, or it's a fit subject if you're doing activism. But if you really want to talk about science and the complexity of what we're living through as a species right now, then you're in a siloed relationship to it, and it can't necessarily connect with our art. I think that way lies madness, right? And I think that, you know, I really love the work of Amitav Ghosh and his book, The Great Derangement, because he talks about how it's essential for us to write our books, make our art with the reflection of reality. And the reality is we are in the midst of eco-collapse. There's no getting around it. If we have special pleading around it and we say, well, it's necessary because we have to talk about this huge issue, then I think we silo it even further, and we remove it from the fact that there's no talking about climate change without talking about other issues that impact the human experience, health and wellness, LGBTQ issues. Like, every single piece of it is connected to every other piece. And I think that my job feels like not only to talk about the emotional impact, to work through it publicly so that other people can engage in their own public working through of their feelings, but also to make a case for the fact that my story as a person who was a single mom raising a kid, you know, while I had an incurable disease, is actually just so connected to the plankton in the North Atlantic as they're undergoing global warming, and that the ways we respond to them publicly, logistically, legislatively are so bound up together that if I don't tell this story with its connection to the environment, I'm leaving out a huge piece of my humanity. And so I love it when our work gets to be kind of moved out of this question of like nature writing or science writing and just kind of moved into, no, writing needs to be addressing this because it's the reality.
I also think part of the way we make meaning as authors is not just braiding stories together, but in poetry in particular, by creating metaphors and similes that allow people to know what something is like. the other thing is we're all kind of micro reporters in certain ways. So climate change is coming for all of us, but not at the same time and not at the same ways. So for example, I live in Madison, Wisconsin. For the last like 4 days, our weather forecast has just been smoke from the Canadian wildfires. Like, I open my weather app and the forecast is literally smoke, which isn't the same way it's impacting, you know, my friends who are in Brooklyn right now or my friends who are in California. And so being a micro reporter for my particular experience and braiding that into larger things, but also using different kinds of language to help people see what something is like, what the experience of living through it is like. It is part of how we can help people reconceptualize that. So when I'm down in Miami trying to figure out a way to explain to people what sunny day flooding is like, when a picture of it is not that interesting, you know, is part of what language can do.
And another thing I think art is really good for, I mean, like poetry and fiction, but all kinds of art are really good for, is that both producing them generally and kind of experiencing or engaging with them, if you really commit to it, is that they are often like slow and difficult instead of fast and easy. And so much of what we are supposed to value right now and what capitalism wants us to value is like the fast and easy thing. And that's what sort of a good chunk of what got us into this mess. And it's not, I don't think that's going to get us out of it. I think we're going to have to do something different to get ourselves out of this. And I think part of that is going to have to be a scaling back, a slowing down, kind of a narrowing of focus into the kind of small, human, beautiful things. And I think that has to be a necessary part of anything we do going forward. And so, like, creating my own art approximates a spiritual practice in this way, and that it takes me out of a lot of what culture is telling me to be really attached to right now. And so, I mean, you can get this experience from like engaging art and observing art, but I think, and this is also, I say this to people and they're like, oh, no, not me, but like making your own art too. A lot of people think like, oh no, I can't, I'm not trained in that, that's not my background. Everyone is like inherently creative, and those things get squashed out of us through messaging or, you know, as we grow up. But like, even just like making your own art and like let it be clumsy and let it be awkward, but like doing that more and more, I think like has like huge healing properties, both like for you and then like it ripples outward for other folks too that you come in contact with.
Something that you said, Claire, sort of brought to mind this idea. We were talking about speed, the speed at which we're being asked to live. For me, a lot of my writing is about processing. And writers typically, we're supposed to process and then write. You know what I mean? Process and then make sense of it, but don't do it at the same time. But we are all being asked to process natural disasters at a clip that the human mind is not built to process. So it's like Hurricane Helene. I mentioned that to a very intelligent friend of mine the other day, and they didn't remember which one I was talking about. So I had to be like, Asheville? Then they remembered. And then like the California wildfires seems like a decade ago. The Texas flood, the girls are still missing. We're not even talking about them. We're moving from incomprehensible natural disaster to incomprehensible natural disaster. My very, very first book was a work of journalism about the Grand Forks, North Dakota flood of 1997, which at the time, and this is so quaint now, was the most expensive natural disaster in American history at $5 billion. And you know, I got to spend a lot of time in that community, and communities take years to recover from these events. And yet we're going from one to the other to the other. And so for me, it's particularly in my stories here, my practice was about processing the incomprehensible, or what philosopher Timothy Morton calls the hyper-object, which we are unable, is so big, so multifaceted that we cannot comprehend it, which he categorizes climate change as a hyper-object. But my guiding light was something that Ursula Le Guin said, which was, we cannot ask reason to take us across the gulfs of the absurd. And that freed me in terms of form to explore how I could talk about climate change, because I knew I wasn't going to be able to write another traditional novel like South Pole Station about what I wanted to say and what I needed to process, which is why some of these stories in here are like menus, and one is a a climate podcast, and then there's some traditional stories. But I agree. Like, the speed is not natural, and nobody's talking about that. And so we're all feeling very alone, and you use the word siloed. Yes. And I feel that way too until we get in groups like this and we talk about it. And it's like, you too. And I think that's what writing is at the end of the day. We're reaching out to someone who maybe we don't know, who's opening the book, and we're like, do you feel this too? Does this resonate with you?
I know you have another question. I had read, it's a quote that I keep encountering, but it's from Aldo Leopold's 1949 Sand County Almanac. And in it, he says, one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Which I think, like, that is part of, like, the risks of, I mean, there's, like, climate scientists are suffering these, like, terrible climate grief because, like, nobody is, like, either listening to them or believing them or not amplifying them. Or, you know, anyone who's reading so much news, especially, like, via social media, which is designed to be algorithmic and just give you the same bad news over and over and isolate you down. It doesn't, you know, social media does not care about an expansive self. It just wants to give you more of the thing that it thinks you want, which isn't always what you want. So, like, things like being in rooms like this, or even like conferences like this, or like engaging in art are one of those ways that we cannot be alone in a world of wounds. I love that quote so much.
That's such a beautiful quote, and I just want to hop in and say, you reminded me of something that I feel like I talk to my students about all the time, which is that the work that we do is trying to help people build a muscle that we require for this moment, which is the ability to comfortably move from the macro to the micro, from Hurricane Helene to what our impact is in our own body or in our neighbor or in the place that we love, to be able to look at the pond down the street and then be able to scale back up and think about, you know, the heat dome that's over the pond. We have to be able to get stronger at doing that. It's not an inherent skill that we have necessarily, and I think we've always used, you know, spirituality and conversations about God and art to be able to help us do that, but we need to be able to do it much more quickly and to be able to do it at scale so that people can process in a different way because it's required at the moment.
Yeah, and I think too, like, it's this, I think with art and with what you do, it's a hunger for language to articulate what someone is really specifically feeling. And I know, like, in terms of the process of writing, it's like that search for that. But, you know, I think some of you maybe knew each other, but I didn't know any of you before this panel. I read all of your work, and they're all very different works, but they all have similar, like, grasping for similar concepts, whether that's how do we face the world that we thought we were going to face now that it's different? How do we deal with loss? How do we chronicle the losses? Like, some of your work has lists of things of what it was like the before times. Some of you are thinking, you know, how we gotta burn this place down. And it's like that irony of, like, we do have to burn this place down and it is burning down. And how do we sort of live with that? So I think also, like, the articulation of what we're all experiencing is, like, basically a mini manifesto to read widely and pursue art, because I think when language hits you in a certain way, you might understand something you always knew the whole time, but it hits you in a deeper way. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
I also think that this is, when you start doing this work and you're touching down into anything that regards science or even touches on the edges of activism, you sort of join a group of people who are all trying to communicate to each other by passing slips of paper across and being like, oh, I see what you're trying to do, and, like, here's what I've been reading about it, and here's how you're connected to it. I've never met a more collaborative group of artists than the people who touch into this work, and also more joyful. I make this comment all the time that, you know, people who are science journalists are among the most hopeful and interesting and fun to hang out with, which is not what you would necessarily expect. But I love when there's that crossover, what we end up doing with each other is saying, oh, but have you read this person? And do you know their work? And this is what you're going to publish. Here, how can I connect you to people doing this work? Because it tends to be a feeling of, this is the most important work we could be doing. And if you're going to join the fight, let's bring you into what's ultimately often a competitive space, right? Art is about, like, making sure that yours is the best, right? Here we're not doing that much, I don't feel. I feel that once you've joined this community, you are definitely trying to lift each other up as you do the work.
So I'd picked out a line from each of your works that I thought maybe we could talk about. Claire, I'm open to yours right now. And this is like one of those moments for me where I knew this, but the language about it was really beautiful. And you write a lot about glaciers. In here, you have many poems with the name of the book called Meltwater. And you say, there is a word for the gone land, the old future, the former time. Is it a graph? Is it a document? Is it a map? And so I loved this idea of the old future for those of us who maybe grew up in the 70s and the 80s and even the 90s. The future we thought we'd have is not the future we're living. So I just wanted to ask you a little bit about this concept and writing it.
Yeah, that's a big one. I think a lot of this comes from, I wrote this book after I had my oldest kid and was pregnant with the second one, or was she born? I think I was pregnant with her, and then she was born as I was writing the last part of the book. And so much of what the book grapples with is like, given everything we know about the world, like given everything I know, like was this still worth it? Like, was this still the right choice? And the book, like there are some like painful poems in the book where it's like, you know, maybe yes, maybe no. I mean, ultimately the book ends with like, yes, despite everything, like, yes, this was worth it. And it's my job to make my children feel like that was worth it. And so like despair is not a word that's in my vocabulary anymore. Like it would have been impossible to bring children into the world and then despair. Like they did not ask to be here. So it is my job to make them fall in love with the world. And so that's a lot of what the book is doing, just as a little context. But yeah, I think that line in particular, so this set of poems that Mitzi drew the line from is about, I don't want to give too much context, imagining, right, sort of like the stories we would tell children in kind of a world where all the glaciers are gone, they don't exist anymore, how we would tell them the rationale for why that, like how we would justify this to them, how we would make that kind of make our excuses. And so the book, this is sort of tricky. There are several kind of attempts. A lot of the book is like attempting it does it in one way, and then it kind of goes back and does the same poem in another way with different words, and then does the same kind of form a third or fourth. I think it does it maybe like 8 times, trying to find the right language for like, well, we thought that we didn't think this would happen. We thought it would be like this, but then it, you know, and so much of it is like, what is the future that we are preparing them for, or what is the future that we have kind of set them up for, which is maybe a different question than the future we're preparing them for. I'm sort of like talking around this. It's a hard line actually to think about. Yeah.
Well, I think it's hard as a human to contend with.
Sure. Yeah.
I just wanted to respond just as a reader of poetry, and that line, the old future, that's what poetry does. I don't write poetry, but when I read it, and it's so rare that I actually read it, that line is like a tomahawk missile to the heart, but like instead of destroying it, it opens it up, but we all know what that means. Mm-hmm. Like I immediately thought of my kids. Yeah. The old future that I thought they were going to be walking into. The old future that maybe everybody in this room, you know, whether they have children or whether it's what they wanted to do in the next 10, 20 years. And that's what we're talking about when we say like communicating with each other. It's like, I feel that. I know what you mean, and because I know what you mean, I know I'm not alone. And so that old future, it sounds so simple, but it's so perfect. And if you know it, you know it. You know what I mean? You know exactly what you're talking about.
Thank you. That was so much more elegant than what I was trying to do. Delightful. Thank you. All of your work is also very place-based. And Erica, your poems, you have a lot of poems that take place in Florida, a lot of poems on a beach. And then you went on a trip, I think, across the country with your family. And in one of your poems called That Has Been Entrusted to Us, you write,
The artists say the land is not the setting for the work, but a part of the work. It is ultimately impossible for the spectator to fully perceive the scope all at once. It is just on the threshold of visibility. So I wanted you to please talk about that and talk about like setting and place and how that really is in so much of your work.
So that's from a weird little poem I wrote that combines notices I was getting from my child's summer camp with kind of weird other things I was discovering. Like I had just read this article that birds were taking spikes from from the fences they put up to keep birds from nesting in places and incorporating them into their actual nests. They were like punk rock birds. And I was really interested in the ways in which that comes from I was using the language of land art to look at different rhetorics of the ways that we talk about the environment. So that poem weaves together steampunk birds, notes from my kids' summer camp, land art language, and ultimately ends with an image of buddy check. Like if anyone remembers when you go swimming at day camp or sleepaway camp, you have to have a buddy and they blow a whistle and you have to find the buddy and then raise each other's arms so they know there's no like kid at the bottom of the lake. But I was envisioning that as a metaphor in some ways for surviving climate change, as a way to survive climate change. That as I was getting these more and more apocalyptic notes from my kids' summer camp, because there was like heat domes and smoke and all the things that are, like becoming not just disruptions, but lifestyle changes for the way that everybody rolls, that there's still gonna be snack, there's still gonna be buddy check. And that's the way we roll through. And so with all of these different inputs that we're getting, I think we're always operating on all these different levels. And so in my work, I try to recreate all of those things coming at us at once, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Ashley, in a lot of your stories, you're using borrowed form. So, for instance, you have I guess it's like a type of SSRI called Climafeel, where it helps people with their feelings of loss over climate change. And you have another one that you just mentioned, which is a crime podcast for climate crime files podcast, episode 276. And these two people are talking about this woman who's has a tree in her yard that was attacked by some kind of beetle. And you have a line in here where they say, it's like a version of the call came from inside the house. And I love that because that's where I think one of the interviewers is basically saying this woman whose tree was dying had this moment of realization, like, no, it wasn't the bugs. It was her behavior. It was our collective human behavior. So the call is coming inside of the house. The danger is us. So I wanted to ask you about that.
It's funny because, when you write short stories, they're written at different times. And for me, one of the challenges was what was speculative in 2017 when I was writing something weird. It's become documentary much more quickly than I thought. And all I do is listen to the scientists. Like I look at what the scientists are saying, and unlike them, I have the luxury to extrapolate imaginary, outcomes. I just didn't expect them to happen so fast. So there's some of these are a little bit too on point at times. There's like in my Craigslist ads, there's a support group for newly displaced Newport Beach homeowners, and I'm thinking about the fires that just took place, and how is this satire? And it's like, well, not anymore. But that piece, that's exactly what I was thinking at the time. I think there's even a line where the son says to the mom whose tree this is, oh, are we the invasive species? And yet, over the last 5-6 years, more and more, I understand that it isn't us. It's a handful of large corporations, extremely wealthy individuals, and they have done the most amazing job of making us think it's our fault. So if we will only buy an electric car, we'll assuage our guilt. If you're taking your kid to soccer practice, 20 miles away, it's your fault. But if you buy this electric car, you're pitching in. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And it becomes enraging because you realize, oh my God, they have the power to immediately start addressing this. But it's an irrationality. Some of you in here are probably familiar with Glenn Albrecht, the environmental philosopher from Australia, who coined the term solastalgia, which informs my whole book. It was like kind of like my Elvis moment, because he like commented on an essay I wrote for LitHub, and I was like, is this the real, like, Glenn, are you serious? And he said, because in my book, solastalgia is a medical condition, and he said, solastalgia is not a medical condition. He said, it's a rational response to the imposition of an irrational social structure, in irrational decision-making. And, so for me, that was very eye-opening. And so that's almost like a relic. There's like relics in here of my processing. So at the time, I was really feeling like, yeah, we're the invasive species. It's not the emerald ash borer. We introduced the emerald ash borer. And it's getting worse because the climate is warming, and we did that. But the more you process and the more you understand, the less it's your fault. The more you are able to identify who created it and who's not acting, and they are one and the same.
Erin, your book has a lot of cataloging of the loss of the world and the loss of nature, and it's told through a young girl's point of view. So, think about when you're like 10, 11 years old and you're climbing trees and running down this, you don't even realize your connection to nature. And in this world that she's in, the seas have risen, and it's a watery world, and she has a special sense for water, and they go on this journey searching for a farm to find refuge in. And you say at the end, we can change the land again with softness, making right what we got so wrong in the years of greed. And I'm wondering if you could talk about this. Greed is also, there's a lot of greed, what Ashley's just talking about, a lot of greed in the world, but there's also a lot of greed in the book for greediness for the world as it was, which is like so understandable. So,
yeah, one thing that is lovely that has happened to me a couple of times is when I've been meeting with readers, they often quote back to me one of my favorite lines from the book, which is that greed and hope are twins, one each reaching for the same thing, one in fear and one in faith. And so I think, one of the things that I wanted to do in writing the book was to process the deep fear that we're all feeling and the way that it makes us grasp for things to hold on to, even just for ourselves, for our family, for our community, with this lack of understanding of how much that greed is actually, it's an inborn, self-protective, connected to desire. In some ways, it's actually really generative and a beautiful part of humanity. And hope is like that too. And I think if we can really think about what it is that we are losing as we pretend that our individual needs and desires are separated from the collective, and we begin to soften into our mutual relationship to each other, and we begin to tell new stories about that mutuality, we begin to operate much more in faith in our own future, in faith in each other. And I think for me, that sort of hope and faith nexus or axis of material was so important to get to, because I feel like we've really lost a way to talk about what that looks like and how much that's part of the joy and the generative, desire-filled part of being a human being, that we spend time concerned about whether we're allowed to think about having children when there are people having, multi-billion-dollar, corporations and multi-million-dollar weddings. Like, I just think that we need to reframe that desire and that feeling of hope and generativity as something that we get to use to remake the future in the image that we would like to make it into. I was really interested in telling a story about collapse. that is set in something that could be called dystopian, right? A dystopian future. I don't love that because I think that we are experiencing collapse. We're in the middle of it. That's real now. What degree it collapses to is, that's open still. That's an open question. And if we think about it as collapse, we can think about what repair looks like after collapse. And that repair requires us to let go of this idea that we bring when we think about, oh, what could be the worst case scenario? I mean, we've been trained on zombie movies where everyone is out for each other, right? And it's just looting and rampaging. And I really love the work of Rebecca Solnit and her book, A Paradise Built in Hell, because she's gone through the historical record and said, well, every time we have a Katrina or a 1910 earthquake, we have a rebuilding. We have mutual aid societies that come up. And of course, there are moments of rupture and failure and chaos and violence. But those are actually in the minority in compared to what we do to protect a future that we all believe in together for our kids, for our communities. And I really wanted to lean into that. I wanted to make sure that that's where we landed because as it took me 10 years to write this book because I wanted to get the science right because my mother was an EPA hydrogeologist. So I knew that even if she wasn't alive anymore by the time it got published, she read a number of drafts and very much like you said, I did not want her taken out of the narrative. I wanted her to be able to be in it and recognize it. But that, looking at what the possible future was and what we could do with it was a project of talking about the science as it evolved and over those 10 years, how we moved from hope being this really ugly word within activist communities, don't talk about it because it's an opioid too. How do we reframe it? And that was the question that came up constantly while I was writing. Is the book hopeful? Does it end on a hopeful thing? I get asked that still before people buy it. Is it hopeful? And I actually made a point to begin the book at the end so that she's looking back on recognizing that she's still working towards a future because we don't lose the future even though there's a collapse. There's still a future out there.
So I guess I'd want to ask then about joy because we started with grief and there's so much to be joyous as artists in the beauty that is still in the world. And I'm curious how joy maybe comes into your process too, or what you need maybe from joy after a day of writing about these things.
That's a big question. So I am grieving, and I'm a soul nostalgic. That's how I identify myself. A soul nostalgia, again, just for anybody who might not know the term, it's not a medical condition. It's just a term that is best described as homesickness before you've left home. And it's just the natural response of human beings who love the planet, which is, I know it's all of us. I know it's all of us. To it changing around them. It's hard. This has been really hard. I'm so grateful that I find a lot of joy in the work that scientists, researchers, policymakers who are doing this difficult work and taking concrete steps to address this. I am so grateful for the work that you do. I often wonder how you process your own pain, your own rage, because you're on the front lines, you look this in the eye, and I don't know how you do it. And I know that there's a mental health epidemic. There's a coming mental health epidemic for soul nostalgics coming, but I know that it's a particular problem in this area, people who are actually doing the work. For me, what helps me survive is literally being outside and planting a tree. And I have an acre, and I have a little nursery under a beautiful sugar maple. She has so many kids, and I can go out there and I can carefully, kind of take one out of the ground, put it in, a little planting like this big. I have hundreds of them. And as they get older, I can then go into my little forest woodlet and I can plant them. And they're not all going to survive, but I'm giving them a chance. And what that helps me do is I spend so much time being angry at what humanity has done to the natural world. I care deeply about how non-human creatures are experiencing climate change. It's all over my book. But it gives me an opportunity to do something that other non-human creatures in nature can't do, which is take my two hands and instead of harming, help. I can move this little seedling from under, her mom's canopy where she may not grow, and I can go move her with my 2 hands and put her in a sunny spot. And that tree, I hope, will be there long after I'm dead. And that keeps me sane, because it provides me a context of knowing also that there's so many other people who do this and do things akin to it. This is what you guys are doing. It reminds me that our hands can help, and that we have the power to help nature, even in the smallest piece. So whatever you're doing in your backyard matters. Whatever you're doing in whatever your small space is, no matter how small it is, growing a tomato matters. And that's what keeps me sane. And that's where I find my joy. Also because it helps me remember that I'm not alone, that there's other people who care deeply about this and are doing things.
One thing that the thing, at least the way I don't practice, despair much anymore. If you want a despair book, this is also available as the one before Meltwater, and that's also available at the bookstore, like all of our books. But the thing about despair, at least the way I had been practicing it, is that it's like a deeply narcissistic emotion. It's very isolating. It's very narcissistic. It's like a painful emotion, but it's also very easy to get into. And it's an emotion that a self who thinks they know everything really it's the product of that kind of self. And it really helps to remind myself that I don't know everything. And I love having learning new things is one of my favorite ways to kind of expand the map of what is possible, or just to kind of expand my mental universe. So I was feeling pretty rough about 7 months ago or 8 months ago maybe, last November, and a book that really helped me just kind of fall back in love with the world and come back kind of alive to myself was Ed Yong's An Immense World. Have you read this? Also at the bookstore, gotta say. And it's so beautiful. It's just such a beautiful book about animal senses and the way animals perceive the world, which often are ways that we don't have we can't see the ultraviolet spectrum, we don't sense magnetic fields. But it was a way of being oh yeah, I do. So every page I was learning something new, which just opened and opened and opened my world again, and it felt so good. Anyway, so I try to read. I do a lot of kind of sciencey nonfiction when I'm feeling kind of overwhelmed or all in my head, and it reminds me of what is actually out there in the world, and it helps me decenter myself. It's easy to get snarled in your own brain and just get on the hamster wheel of ruminating and spiraling, and just grounding myself with what is actually out in the world and how much I don't know about it is just such a gift every time.
I also think that the opposite. So just to push against the really easy concept of joy, I think there's a rabbi named Alan Liu who talks about the idea that any feeling fully felt is joy, and I think that to me it's engagement versus disengagement. And so I have a daily walking practice. I just always go out for a walk. I even have crampons for the winter, but. When I feel myself becoming disengaged, I have an amazing colleague who's a cartoonist named Linda Barry, who has this wonderful method called Quick Diary, where you spend 5 minutes a day writing down 5 things you saw today, 5 things you did today, a little snippet of something you overheard, and a little 30-second sketch of something you saw. And just doing that for 2 weeks can bring me back into engagement with the physical world. And for me, that's something that I'll go in and out of practicing, because I think, again, the opposite of joy to me is disengagement.
Yeah, and it's very similar to what everyone else has said, but the thing that I have done for more than a decade is that I have a regular relationship to hiking and to finding places within the region that I live in. I'm not from the Midwest. I live here now. I'm in Chicago. But finding a relationship to beauty in the Midwest has been an evolving practice. My husband calls it microclimates, micro joys, little granular beauties. and falling in love with the prairie, falling in love with a new ecosystem, being able to learn it, having my little Merlin app and my little iNaturalist app on my phone, and like just absolutely immersing myself for a few hours every week in a place that I don't know, that I have to form a relationship with, that I have to be in curiosity about. And I feel like that's my doorway to joy always, is curiosity about something that I don't actually. I love that idea that you mentioned of not knowing the answer, that's a really wonderful antidote to despair, because I think as humans, we really are best when we're in curiosity and when we recognize that we don't know the future, and staying in that place of aliveness, of I'm not sure what I'm encountering or what I'm going to encounter, is a practice that's super important to me. So yeah.
I want to open it up if anyone has questions. We have about 6 minutes left. Happy to take a question for any of these brilliant minds.
Is this on? I'm just really curious. Like, I work with a lot of lawyers and scientists, and I'm a fundraiser. So translating super wonky, super policy, super really, especially now, deep legal shenanigans is the best way I can say it. Oh, is hard to translate. It's hard to translate to people who also maybe don't understand it, but wouldn't say they don't understand it. So like making that connection between like the importance of science and policy and law, but communicating in a way that touches down to their lived experience is a real challenge. And I just wonder, I guess I'm also thinking of you as being a journalist, like how do you translate?
I think it's story. I mean, that's how we communicate to each other. Whether it's a personal story, whether it's, we talk about, Erica talked about metaphor, putting it in a way that they'll understand. I think a lot about the research on vaccines, and that research and data tends to make people who don't want to vaccinate their children even more staunch in their opposition. But storytelling, a physician talking to a vaccine hesitant parent about vaccinating her own child. And I felt also, I understand your concerns, I felt the same way, but here's what happened. The story of how that doctor, decided to make, came to that decision. So you have a lot of things that you have to try to synthesize, and I get that. And I know it's can be very pat to say storytelling, but if you can think about how you relate to it, why are you doing this work? It's good to always remember, tell yourself the story. Why am I doing this work? And then what you know about whoever you're speaking with. Find that commonality. But I don't know if you agree, but I would say storytelling is how we communicate those complex ideas to people who need to understand them, because they are, eyes do glaze over. Sometimes it's my eyes glazing over, even though I want to know,
Yeah, and I think it's an invitation to vulnerability that's encased within that story, right? Is that, I was trying for a long time to tell the story I wanted to tell in my memoir about the world's fastest warming marine ecosystem, which I've just said that, and half of you have glazed over in that moment, which is the Gulf of Maine. But in order to tell that story, I found that the only way that I could really keep myself and other readers engaged was to say, okay, you want to talk about the Clean Air and Water Act, right? The Clean Air and Water Act happened in the same year that the legislation that protects kidney patients was also passed by the Nixon administration. And if I just tell you that, it's fine, that's kind of interesting, Nixon administration. But if I tell you that my family's life was entirely changed by the fact that it was possible for my father to get dialysis and transplant because of that, and also that there's an ecosystem that went through almost complete extirpation of all of its life, the Long Island Sound, in 1987, and the Clean Air and Water Act has meant that in 2022 there were whales that were spotted there for the first time since the 50s. It changes the story. And then you listen to me for the 5 minutes that I take of your time to talk to you about why that legislation was important. But what you're really going to take away was, oh, here's this set of people that I have connected to, that I'm lightly in love with because the book is written well, or you get to know them, or there's openness and vulnerability in my willingness to tell their story on the page. And I think the more that you can do that, it's exactly what you've just said. Like, it's the doorway to open up to that conversation, because we are underneath all of the policy decisions and the rhetoric and the language we have to use and the formalities of where most of you work all the time. There are 1,000 people that are directly impacted by it. And I think the more that we can make those stories the centerpiece of the way that we talk about what legislation does, the better off we are.
So I want to, yeah, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So I think several of you mentioned that you are mothers. I have recently become a mother. I've also been doing this work for a long time. I think there's a unique responsibility that you feel when you bring a human into the world of, oh shit, what have I done? I think I see a lot of women in the room, and I'm wondering if we think that there's kind of a gap or a divide in shouldering that responsibility among men. Some of my favorite climate novels have been written by men, but I'm just kind of curious. It's an all I'm female panel, so I'm just kind of wondering your take on that as folks who are active in the industry, and is there anything that we need to do? For instance, I talk about this a lot with my partner. He doesn't feel the same responsibility that I do. So I'm just kind of curious to get your perspectives on that.
We don't have tons of time, but one book I'm going to recommend if you have not read it is Lessons for Survival by Emily Rabideau. After the colon, it's mothering through against the apocalypse, which deals with all kinds of things, but is very much about that, and ties all of this to race, to urbanization and other things. But I think her meditations on the topic are wonderful. So, Lessons for Survival by Emily Rabideau, Raboteau.
We had one more question and 0 more minutes. So let's see if we can do a very quick, and then all of these wonderful writers will be at the bookstore with their books, signing it, selling it afterwards, so you can continue the conversation with them individually and right here.
Sure. Maybe it's not a quick answer, so that's okay. I'll come meet you all later, because my first question is, can we hang out? Because this is just really great, and I'm resonating so much with everything. Anyway, I could go on. And I lived in the Twin Cities, so I think my question is kind of, I feel like people are numbing themselves, probably a lot subconsciously, culturally, because it's so intense, right? This is almost unbearable at times for many of us. And if you could use your imagination, what does a future look like where there's actually like a backlash against that numbing, and people actually feel called to like feel deeply, authentically connected again to each other in the world?
That's an entire narrative world in one's mind, and I'm sure we all have some scaffolding. But I love that you use the word backlash, because I think that's the level of intensity that's required to break through that numbness. And everything that you said makes sense and is happening. And I love your question. So let's chat after. Yeah, let's chat.
Find us.
Yeah.
It's probably the opposite of Climophile, which is in Ashley's book about how we can deal with it. It's like the opposite of what puts us in. So it's like called Climate Act drug, certified by the FDA. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for making the trip. Thank you so much for coming. We are so grateful. And if you're interested in the podcast, I have bookmarks, and you can meet all these ladies at the book sale. Thank you.